Before the first light of dawn, 17 doors fell open at once. What the world thought were aid offices and technology hubs were unmasked as vaults of surveillance, holding the stolen breath of a nation. 2 million profiles, call logs, and even cabinet secrets lay captured in servers disguised as gifts. For 15 years, this quiet theft drained the bloodstream of Burkina Faso, a nation told it was developing while its dignity was being siphoned away. In that hour, Captain Ibrahim Traoré gave a different order: not to request, not to plead, but to reclaim. Operation Clear Sight was not simply a raid, it was a declaration that Africa's soil would not be mined twice, once for gold and once for data. Yet, as the dust of servers settled, a larger question rose with the sun. If data is the new territory, who will defend these invisible borders? And if one small landlocked nation can resist, what stops the rest? Do not look away. What comes next may change how Africa defines its freedom. Subscribe and keep walking with us. The story begins at 5 o'clock in the morning, when silence still held the streets of Ouagadougou. Orders had already been signed by Captain Ibrahim Traoré, and by 7 o'clock, security forces were in motion. 17 targets, scattered across the capital, were struck with surgical precision. From the outside, they looked harmless, glass-paneled offices with aid logos, dusty warehouses labeled as educational centers, modern hubs for digital agriculture. But when the locks fell and the servers hummed, another reality was revealed. Behind the banners of development lay years of concealed machinery, encrypted routers, satellite uplinks, databases storing fingerprints, voter rolls, medical records, and call metadata reaching back nearly a decade. One warehouse just 2 blocks from the Ministry of Education contained the personal details of more than 2 million Burkinabe citizens, names, addresses, biometric scans, all funneled through concealed channels towards servers abroad. Investigators traced many of those streams to Herzliya, a city known for its intelligence infrastructure in Israel. The raids unfolded almost like a choreography. Black vehicles sealed off streets, helicopters hovered over districts close to ministries, and units carried out seizures in less than 20 minutes per site. By 8:45, all 17 locations were secured. Civilian casualties were avoided. The operation had been executed quietly, yet the impact was thunderous. Never before had a West African nation dismantled such an extensive espionage architecture in one single morning. Eyewitnesses described the scene: troops emerging with racks of hard drives, crates of sealed servers, and bundles of classified documents. Videos posted on social media showed soldiers lifting equipment into armored trucks, their faces stern, their actions deliberate. Hashtags like Our Data, Our Choice, and Africa Not for Sale trended within hours. While Western media remained hesitant, African outlets flooded the airwaves with rolling coverage. Among the seized evidence was more than stolen identity data. Technical files mapped the veins of the nation gold and manganese deposits marked with military precision, routes for extraction already charted. Another cache included transcripts of cabinet discussions, encrypted yet copied wholesale. A single router found in a national telecom switchboard had been duplicating every government call and forwarding it abroad. For Dr. Samuel Kabore, a digital security researcher at the University of Ouagadougou, the conclusion was clear. This was not development assistance. This was surveillance dressed in benevolence. The sheer scale of what was uncovered startled even the authorities who had planned the raid. Encryption protocols indicated a level of sophistication far beyond local capacity, suggesting coordination, not coincidence. It was a network, not a cluster. 15 years of infiltration had woven itself into the everyday services that citizens trusted: voter registration drives, education projects, agricultural data platforms. What seemed like progress had hidden another purpose: to copy, extract, and control. Symbolically, the event echoed deeper wounds. In the past, Africa had seen its soil mined, its resources carted away, its voices silenced. Now, in the age of fiber cables and satellites, the extraction was less visible, but no less invasive. The raids exposed how sovereignty can be hollowed out, not by soldiers at borders, but by codes inside machines. For Burkina Faso, this morning was a turning point. Operation Clear Sight announced that the country would no longer be a laboratory, a blind spot, or a vault to be raided invisibly. It declared that dignity resided not just in land, but in data, not just in maps, but in the invisible wires that carried the lifeblood of governance. Yet the question that remained was larger than the nation itself. If one dawn strike could dismantle such a network in Ouagadougou, what would follow in Lagos, Nairobi, or Addis Ababa? The dust of the servers had barely settled, but the storm of reaction was only beginning. When the first reports of Operation Clear Sight reached the public, disbelief quickly gave way to a tide of anger. By mid-morning, the streets of Ouagadougou carried a different sound, not the sirens of the raids, but the chants of citizens. Placards appeared as if painted overnight. Our data, our choice, and Africa is not for sale. Young activists used walls as canvases, spraying slogans that would later travel across the continent. The revelation that millions of personal profiles had been siphoned abroad struck at the heart of ordinary life. A market vendor asked a journalist, "If even my phone calls are not mine, what is left of independence?" Captain Ibrahim Traoré himself set the tone. Standing before cameras the following day, his words carried a weight far beyond national borders. "Africa is no longer your laboratory," he declared. "We are not your test subjects, and this continent will no longer be your blind spot." The phrase ignited both fury and pride. For many, it was the first time a head of state spoke of digital sovereignty with the urgency of war. Within hours, neighboring nations acted. In Bamako, Malian authorities announced the shutdown of 3 firms accused of funneling data abroad. In Niamey, Niger's officials confirmed that a surveillance compound hidden within an embassy had been neutralized. Conakry's interim government froze all military imports linked to Israeli suppliers, while Togo suspended telecom contracts pending full investigation. What had begun as a national raid was now unfolding as a regional cascade. The symbolism was striking. For decades, heads of state in West Africa had convened mainly to discuss aid packages, debt relief, or loans from abroad. Now, they were calling each other not to request, but to resist. Dr. Amadou Sissoko, a political scientist in Bamako, summarized the shift. For the first time in decades, West African leaders are uniting not to ask for help, but to safeguard themselves against it. Crowds mirrored this defiance. In Bamako, students marched with banners reading "Africa is not for sale." In Conakry, mothers walked in silence, holding placards that declared, "Digital sovereignty is national sovereignty." In Ouagadougou itself, nightfall brought bonfires where young voices sang, "Our future will not be sold." The mood was more than protest. It was the rising of a collective consciousness. Media narratives diverged sharply, while Western outlets hesitated, framing the events as destabilizing. African platforms filled the vacuum with rolling commentary. Hashtags like "Africa Rises Digital" and "Not Development," occupation surged. Al Jazeera described the operation as the unveiling of a hidden empire. China's Global Times called it a turning point in Africa's technological independence. Russia's coverage emphasized the hypocrisy of those who lecture sovereignty while violating it. The intensity of the public mood left governments little room to maneuver. Only 2 days after the raids, 6 heads of state from Mali, Guinea, Niger, Togo, Ghana, and Benin gathered in Ouagadougou for an unannounced summit. Around a single folder of documents recovered during the operation, they debated the first draft of a continental digital sovereignty framework. Traore proposed 4 pillars: no foreign telecom investment without transparent infrastructure audits, all citizen data stored physically within African borders, immediate expulsion of undeclared intelligence activities, and mutual defense. An attack on one nation's digital sovereignty would be treated as an attack on all. The proposal was met not with applause, but with careful questions, yet momentum built. Ghana's president stressed the need for enforceable oversight. Togo's delegation demanded legal binding, not symbolism. By the end, a consensus emerged, and each leader signed a declaration recognizing digital sovereignty as a continental priority. Observers compared the moment to the Monroe Doctrine in 19th century America, but this time in fiber cables instead of frontiers. For ordinary Africans, the summit was proof that their voices mattered. Social media lit up with celebratory posts, blending memes with manifestos. A student in Lagos tweeted, "We once fought for borders of land. Now we fight for borders of data." In marketplaces and classrooms, conversations shifted. Digital rights were no longer the language of engineers, but of citizens. The crescendo of this moment was not only in speeches or meetings, but in the sense that history was bending. Africa, once studied as a subject, was now declaring itself the author of its digital destiny. And yet, as the cheers echoed, a darker question loomed. How would the outside world respond to this defiance? The continent had found its voice, but what reply would come from beyond its shores? At first, citizens spoke with disbelief, not only at the scope of the espionage, but at the idea that their lives had been mapped and traded like commodities. Soon, disbelief turns into a profound sense of awakening. Ordinary life began to feel the change almost immediately. Within 6 months, data costs fell by nearly half as the government restructured contracts under strict transparency rules. Internet speeds doubled when foreign middlemen were cut out and regional providers stepped in. Cybersecurity breaches, once frequent, dropped by nearly 50%. Families in Ouagadougou who had long rationed mobile data now streamed lectures and medical consultations without fear of hidden surveillance. For many, these small shifts in daily experience embodied something larger, a sense of regaining control. Markets, classrooms, and community gatherings became forums of debate. At the University of Kudugu, students described digital sovereignty as the second independence. In the capital's markets, vendors spoke of privacy rights with the same urgency as land rights. Community radio hosts began broadcasting discussions on how data should be treated as a national resource. What had once been a technical issue for engineers was now a civic concern for all. Politically, the transformation was no less striking. The Burkinabe government codified emergency measures into a legislative framework. All citizen data would henceforth be stored on servers physically located within national borders. Any foreign company wishing to operate would undergo regular third-party audits, and failure to comply would result in immediate contract termination. The parliament, usually divided on ideological lines, passed the framework with overwhelming support. To many deputies, This was not a partisan issue, but a matter of national survival. Beyond legislation, the government took steps to symbolize the new era. Billboards appeared across the capital proclaiming, "Our data, our future." Schools introduced civic lessons on digital rights. Civil society organizations launched workshops to educate rural populations on how information could be exploited. These efforts were not simply propaganda. They were attempts to build a culture where sovereignty was understood as both tangible and digital. The opposition was not silent. Some critics argued that such policies risked isolating the nation, scaring away investors, and stalling development. Business leaders worried about losing contracts with European firms accustomed to opaque practices. Yet their voices were met with a growing chorus of citizens who asked, "What is the cost of development if it means surrendering dignity?" At the regional level, the ripple effects expanded. Neighboring states began conducting their own audits of telecom systems and aid-linked projects. In Bamako, a parliamentary inquiry revealed irregular contracts signed over a decade. In Niamey, officials suspended infrastructure projects until full transparency was assured. Each move suggested that Burkina Faso's stand was contagious. This moment was more than a national policy change. It resonated as part of a broader historical struggle. For generations, African nations had fought to free themselves from colonial exploitation of land and labor. Now, with data as the new resource, the struggle was shifting domains. As one commentator put it, the new empire does not send soldiers. It sends servers. To many across the continent, the framework debated in Ouagadougou read like a manifesto for anti-colonial Africa in the 21st century. Still, questions lingered. Could the government maintain technical capacity to enforce its new rules? Could local engineers replace the expertise of foreign firms? Would the unity shown at the summit hold once external pressure mounted? These uncertainties created a sense of fragile triumph, victory at dawn, but shadows at dusk. Public sentiment, however, remained strong. A survey conducted by the Institute for Pan-African Studies reported that 68% of respondents across West Africa supported digital sovereignty laws in their own countries, with the figure rising to over 80% among those under 30. For the younger generation, sovereignty was no longer confined to borders drawn on a map. It was in the wires, the clouds, and the codes that shaped their futures. The consequences also extended to security and governance. Intelligence agencies, once passive consumers of imported technology, began building their own capabilities. Local startups emerged to fill the vacuum, offering cloud storage solutions and secure messaging platforms. Some were crude, others ambitious, but all were driven by the conviction that Africa could create its own digital path. And yet, even as the nation celebrated, whispers of retaliation emerged. Foreign investors hinted at withdrawing. Western governments cautioned against isolationist policies. Critics abroad painted the framework as radical. The people of Burkina Faso knew the storm was coming, but for the first time, they felt prepared to weather it together. Sovereignty had been reclaimed at home, but how would the wider world respond to this defiance? While the streets of Ouagadougou echoed with chants of pride, the corridors of power abroad vibrated with unease. Within 24 hours of the raids, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu placed a direct call to Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Official accounts described the conversation as short, tense, and without resolution. Netanyahu insisted Israel's involvement was purely developmental. Traoré's reply was unambiguous. "There is no misunderstanding when you spy on us. That is not development. That is occupation." The exchange set the tone for an international standoff. In Paris, newspapers painted Traoré as authoritarian. In London, commentators claimed his actions destabilized the region. In Washington, think tanks labeled him radical and a threat to regional stability. Yet across African capitals, the perception was different. Demonstrations spread from Bamako to Conakry, from Niamey to Accra. Slogans on banners and social media declared a simple truth: sovereignty in the digital age is as vital as sovereignty over land. The African Union quickly convened an emergency session in Addis Ababa. Delegates from 25 member states debated late into the night. Nigeria's representative made a declaration that drew applause. If one nation is spied on, all nations are spied on. If one loses sovereignty, all of us lose. The chamber erupted, signaling that what began in Burkina Faso was becoming a continental cause. Reactions beyond Africa were divided. European Union officials issued cautious warnings, suggesting sanctions if Burkina Faso pursued policies incompatible with international investment norms. France suspended certain training programs, citing a breakdown of trust. By contrast, new partners emerged on the horizon. China proposed constructing fiber optic networks under full African ownership. India pledged to build regional data centers, promising jobs and training. Russia offered cybersecurity expertise under African oversight. This diplomatic pivot altered the balance of power. For the first time in decades, African governments found themselves courted not as aid recipients, but as negotiators setting conditions. A Ghanaian official captured the shift. The world is at our table. We will decide the rules. Media coverage mirrored the divide. Western outlets often echoed caution, framing the doctrine as isolationist. Meanwhile, African platforms and some Asian channels highlighted the exposure of a hidden empire. Independent journalists in Lagos revealed how foreign algorithms had influenced food pricing and mining contracts. Investigative programs in Nairobi exposed how voter registration databases were mirrored abroad. Each revelation reinforced public conviction that Africa's digital resources had long been treated as open fields for exploitation. Amid this clash of narratives, a new vocabulary emerged. Politicians, analysts, and protesters alike began to speak of African sovereignty not as an abstract principle, but as a practical defense against invisible domination. Sovereignty was no longer only about borders patrolled by soldiers. It was about cables, satellites, and servers controlled by Africans for Africans. Yet with new recognition came new risks. Western think tanks warned of digital isolation. Financial institutions hinted at restricting loans. Technology giants lobbied for exemptions. The struggle for independence, it seemed, had shifted to conference rooms and policy papers as much as to streets and summits. The world had heard Africa's defiance. But would it stand firm when alliances, sanctions, and temptations came knocking? The dawn raid on 17 facilities in Ouagadougou may have lasted only a few hours, but its echoes now stretch into the horizon. The question before Burkina Faso, and indeed all of Africa, is whether Operation Clear Sight will mark a permanent doctrine or fade into a passing moment of defiance. On one path lies opportunity. By enforcing local data laws, the government has cleared space for indigenous innovation. Startups, once overshadowed by multinational corporations, are stepping forward. In Accra, a Ghanaian firm has launched a cloud platform certified under the new sovereignty standards. In Lagos, a fintech company has relocated its servers back from Europe to comply with domestic regulations. These moves, though small, suggest a future where Africa does not merely consume digital tools, but creates them. If nurtured, this ecosystem could redefine the continent's economic landscape, making it a producer rather than a perpetual client. There are also signs of cultural renewal. Across universities, students describe digital sovereignty as the second independence. Street art portrays broken data chains, and community radio programs debate algorithms with the same urgency once reserved for elections. The notion of sovereignty is no longer confined to flags and armies. It now includes firewalls, fiber cables, and encryption. For a continent whose youth make up the majority, this redefinition could fuel a generational movement. Yet the risks are formidable. Building secure data centers demands heavy investment. Training engineers requires time and resources. Without vigilance, sovereignty could remain a slogan rather than a lived reality. External pressures are mounting. Some Western governments threaten sanctions, while technology giants lobby aggressively for loopholes. Even among African leaders, unity may waver once economic temptations arrive. Still, momentum appears strong. The African Union is considering enshrining digital sovereignty as a continental principle, a shared defense akin to protecting territorial borders. If such a framework becomes binding, it could serve as Africa's Monroe Doctrine for the digital age, a declaration that the continent will not be a laboratory nor a data mine for others. For Burkina Faso, the road ahead will demand resilience. The early victories of cheaper internet and stronger security must be consolidated into long-term capacity. Local firms must be nurtured and alliances carefully managed. The task is not only to reclaim dignity, but to sustain it against the storms to come. The dawn has broken, but the day is just beginning. The question is not whether Africa can rise. It already has. The question is whether this rise can endure. Building a continent that commands respect, not just for its soil and resources, but for its digital strength and its unshakable will. The light has arrived, but will it become a lasting sun or fade into another fleeting sunrise? From the silence of dawn raids to the roar of continental debates, Operation Clear Sight has traveled far beyond Burkina Faso. What began as the unsealing of 17 doors has become a symbol of a continent unlocking its future. The evidence: 2 million stolen profiles, satellite maps of minerals, intercepted cabinet calls, revealed not only espionage, but an invisible occupation that had lasted for years. Yet the deeper revelation was this: Africa is not powerless in the digital age. The citizens of Ouagadougou, the students in Bamako, the mothers marching in Conakry all carried the same message. Independence is unfinished if data remains under foreign control. In their chants and their silence, they reframed sovereignty for the 21st century. It was no longer only about borders on maps, but about the codes, wires, and signals that shape daily life. For many, the framework that emerged in Ouagadougou reads like a manifesto for anti-colonial Africa. It does not reject the world, but refuses exploitation. It insists that partnerships be built on transparency, that development mean dignity, and that no nation be reduced to a laboratory. The dream is ambitious, but it is also practical. Laws, audits, servers, and oversight that anchor sovereignty in tangible systems. International reactions remain divided. Some paint these steps as isolationist, others as revolutionary. But the people most affected have already spoken. They see a dawn worth defending. They believe that African sovereignty is not an abstract principle, but a lived necessity, as vital as clean water or secure borders. The challenge now is endurance. Can this movement survive sanctions, lobbying, and the temptations of easy contracts? Can it train engineers fast enough to secure its cables, fund data centers to host its people's information, and keep unity across 54 nations? These questions remain open, but their weight is matched by the will of a rising generation. Operation Clear Sight was more than a raid. It was a declaration. It was the moment a small landlocked country showed that freedom could be reclaimed not only with rifles, but with servers. It was the moment when the world was reminded that the struggle of anti-colonial Africa is not finished, only transformed. If this story moves you, do not let it fade into silence. Share your voice in the comments. Subscribe to keep this movement alive, and stand with Africa as it writes its next chapter, not as a subject of history, but as its author.